Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we dealt with the first part of Amos's first oracle as it occurs in the first two chapters of the prophetic book of that name. We noted that, despite Israel, the northern kingdom, being Amos's main target, he began by denouncing several foreign countries and even lambasting Judah, the southern kingdom, and his own home territory. That was brilliant rhetorical strategy, in a sense softening up listeners in Israel as they would not have minded hearing a prophet taking others to task. However, now Amos zeroes in on Israel. That is found in Amos chapter 2, verses 5 through 16. As with the other countries, Amos begins with the by now well-known formula for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. The I is, of course, the Israelite deity. Then Amos lights into their sins. When Amos took on the foreign nations, their crimes mostly came under the category of war crimes. When he dealt with Judah, he criticized primarily their refusal to behave as good Israelites according to their covenant with God. A variation of that same theme obtains when he has Israel in his sights. First, he brings up the matter of dishonest business practices, which makes the lives of the poor miserable. Specifically, Amos says that business people in Israel were selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes. Evidently, this refers to dealing with debts. When people who have bought on credit are either charged too much interest or cannot make regular payments on their bills, that is, when they default on their loans, their debts are bought by a third party. This makes the debtors vulnerable to quote-unquote being sold, which is probably not outright slavery, but something more on the lines of oppressive servitude. That is, folk who could not pay were forced into even more economically disadvantageous situations, thus increasing their poverty. The fact that this is done for a minimal amount of debt for the price of a pair of shoes, only makes this practice more egregious. Amos will have something more to say about these unethical business practices later in the book, but this is his opening salvo. Just in case the business class in Israel does not understand the imagery, Amos goes on to accuse them of trampling the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and not lifting a finger to help the afflicted. That's in verse 7 of chapter 2. The covenant says a great deal about Israel taking care of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and other stereotypical impoverished people. But the opposite is happening in Israel's stores, shops, and markets. This is shameful behavior for Israelites. Having dealt with indefensible business practices, Amos goes on to a second topic, idolatrous religious behavior. The specifics are, quote, a man and his father go into the same woman and thereby profane God's name, end of quote. This has less to do with sexual promiscuity than it does with non-Israelite religious practices. The woman in this case is a cult prostitute, called elsewhere a kudeshah. This reflects Canaanite fertility rites in which sexual intercourse is supposed to induce the gods to foster fertility. Stock animals will bear offspring, crops will be fertilized, perhaps even one's own family will increase. This is all seen as a boon to economic activity. Of course, this is an outright violation of the covenant. The Israelite deity was seen to be in charge of economic activity and prosperity. The Lord would prosper one's herds and flocks, making them flourish. The Lord would enable crops to grow. The Lord would also bless your own family with babies. To be sure, these were general blessings, but they also had economic implications. Israelites had no business in engaging with fertility rites to make these things happen. As the prophet pointed out, this behavior was flat out profane. Amos elaborates by describing more of the rituals that are observed in this activity, including laying down garments by altars, a form of pledging to a Canaanite god, and also drinking wine bought with the money from people who had been fined for some offense or another. Here we have a combination of, once again, dubious business practices and illicit religious practices. That's in verse 8. At this point, the oracle goes into a completely different direction. Instead of mentioning another grievous sin, Amos rehearses what the Israelite God had already done for the people. In short, he outlines God's gracious acts in the past in the people's behalf. 3 things are mentioned, not necessarily in order of occurrence. Speaking for God, so to speak, Amos points out that God took care of the Amorites, who were incredibly powerful for you. This is an allusion to the conquest as it plays out in the book of Joshua. In this instance, Amorite is a collective term for all the inhabitants of the promised land. Though a powerful people, the Lord enabled Israel to be victorious over them. That's in verse 9. The second mighty act of God was, as you might imagine, the exodus from Egypt, which also involved a 40-year trek in the wilderness on the way to Canaan. That would not have happened were it not for the Israelite deity. That's in verse 10. The third thing that Amos cites is God's providing religious personnel for Israel's benefit. This included a prophetic ministry and people who made special religious commitments, people who were called Nazarites. They took vows, very, very strict vows, that set them apart from the general population. That's in verse 11. After bringing up these magnalia Dei, these mighty acts of God, Amos notes what Israel's response was. Instead of appreciating the special religious vows of the Nazarites, you forced them to drink wine. Famously, abstention from alcohol was one of the most basic vows for Nazarites. The Israelites scoffed at this and even had a little fun at the expense of people that they regarded not as religious stalwarts, but as prudes. Not only did they disdain Nazarites, they also had no use for prophets, especially of Amos's ilk. They did not mind certain prophets, but would countenance only those who did not accuse them of any wrongdoing. Given Israel's egregious reaction to God's grace, no one will be surprised that Amos goes to the next topic, namely judgment. His imagery for this judgment is quite graphic. Amos uses language in which God presses people down like a cart full of sheaves. That's in verse 13. In addition, the prophet adds that the swift will be too slow to run, the strong will weaken, and the mighty person will be unable to escape harm. It gets worse. An archer has no chance. No one will be fast enough to get away from danger. Someone riding on a horse will not find refuge. Indeed, someone of great courage will be forced to flee naked, that is, unarmed. Here are the ingredients of this image in a nutshell. A cart full of freshly harvested grain is heavy, very heavy. That makes it, of course, very slow to move. The image intimates that just as harvesters have loaded the cart, a raiding party appears on the horizon. It is looking to steal the freshly harvested grain. Even a small raiding party will be formidable when it goes against unarmed farmers who have just reaped their crop. Presumably on galloping horses, the raiding party attacks. Everyone scatters, no one is armed, even the fastest runners have no chance. Only a horse or so is available to the farmers so desperate to escape. The farmers no longer worry about the grain being confiscated. They will be lucky to get away with their lives. In a sense, this image is like a bad dream, a nightmare. Think of the times you have dreamt of someone or something threatening your very life. In the dream, you try to run, but somehow you are in mud, or your legs are heavy and slow. You try to scream, but nothing comes out of your mouth. You don't even know in which direction to go. You are doomed. There is no escape. Unconsciousness awaits you. Just about everyone has had a dream like that. This is the image that Amos portrays. God's judgment will come in the form of a raiding party licking its chops at how easy it will be to rout you, defeat you, scatter you, and take something precious from you. Amos's rhetorical skills did not stop with his clever going around the map, waiting to focus on Israel, his primary target. Once Amos has Israel's attention, his prophetic rhetoric soars to new heights. We may have occasion in a future podcast to treat this prophetic material. For now, though, I leave you with this thought. Very early on in the podcast series, I noted my conviction that Israel, as it is depicted in the Old Testament, is a figure for the Christian church. If I am right, we do not have the luxury of thinking that Amos is only addressing Israel with these disturbing words and these disorienting images. Just saying. I want you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is, so I have a way to contact you. And also, if you want me to answer any questions in a future Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.